Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. Today we're diving deep into a dark part of history, one that doesn't get enough attention. The Assyrian Genocide. We've got documents from the Assyrian Policy Institute and first-hand accounts. We're going to uncover this genocide, understand its stages, its lasting impact, and look at how the Assyrian people have shown such resilience.
Before we get into the Assyrian experience specifically, it's really important we're all clear on what genocide actually means.
Right, because I think sometimes we hear the word genocide, but we don't really grasp the full weight of it.
Yeah.
So what makes something a genocide?
So legally, genocide has two core elements. First, there's got to be a clear intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a certain group,
Okay.
whether it's national, ethnic, racial, or religious.
Okay.
Second, the 5 acts that count as genocide.
Good.
Killing group members, causing serious harm, mental or physical,
Yeah.
setting up conditions to destroy them, preventing births within the group, and transferring children by force to another group.
So it's not just about the number of killings, it's about the plan to completely wipe out a group's existence.
Exactly. And this concept was really brought to light by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer. He's the one who actually came up with the term genocide.
Wow.
And what's interesting is he was deeply affected by the Simele Massacre, which we'll talk about later,
Oh, wow.
as well as the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocides.
So he was directly impacted by the very things we're talking about today. How did he describe this systematic plan of destruction?
He stressed it's about destroying the foundation of a group's existence.
Yeah.
So their institutions, political, social, their culture, language, national feelings, religion, their economic livelihood. It's destroying personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and yeah, even the lives of the people in that group.
It's like this deliberate plan to completely get rid of a group, not just physically, but culturally and socially. Does it just happen overnight? Or is there a pattern, something we can look for?
Well, that's where the 10 stages of genocide come in. This framework, developed by Dr. Gregory Stanton, helps us understand how it progresses.
Okay.
It starts with classification, dividing people into us and them.
Okay.
Then it goes through symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, where they're seen as less than human.
Right, and then it's easier to do horrible things to them.
Right, it's a scary thought. That's the whole point. This makes it easier for the next stages.
Right.
Organization, governments creating units to carry out their plans, polarization, spreading propaganda to make the hate worse.
Right.
Preparation, physically separating victims, and tragically persecution and extermination.
And then it doesn't end there, does it? It was one final stage.
Right. Denial, the perpetrators try to hide what they did, destroy the evidence, silence anyone who talks about it.
To avoid taking responsibility.
Right.
Trying to erase the crime. Okay, so we'll keep an eye out for these 10 stages during the Assyrian Genocide. But first, we have to remember, the Assyrian Genocide wasn't just a single event. It was a series of massacres and persecution that spanned decades, even centuries.
You're right, and what we see is a long and tragic history of violence against the Assyrian people. The first recorded instance is back in 1843 with the massacres led by Bedr Khan Beg.
Okay, so that's almost 80 years before the atrocities during World War I.
Right.
What was the trigger for this early violence?
Bedr Khan Beg was a Kurdish leader who saw the Assyrians, who were primarily Christian, as a threat to Kurdish control in the Hakkari region.
Okay.
This is an area where Assyrians had lived for centuries.
So it sounds like it wasn't just religious differences. There were already tensions, political and territorial, at play.
Exactly. The Assyrians had their own system of governance and often resisted attempts at external control. This caused friction with groups wanting to assert their power in the region. The 1843 massacres were particularly brutal. Bedr Khan Beg's forces killed at least 10,000 Assyrians, enslaved women and children, and looted and burned villages, destroyed churches.
During those attacks, a huge collection of Assyrian manuscripts was lost. These manuscripts were more than just religious texts, weren't they?
Absolutely. They held historical, cultural, literary knowledge passed down for generations. Destroying them was deliberate, not just to wipe out the people, but to erase their collective memory and identity.
That's a devastating loss. But this was just the beginning. The worst persecution was during World War I, part of the Ottoman-Turkish campaign to wipe out Christian minorities.
Right, and this is what people usually mean when they talk about the Assyrian Genocide. Between 1915 and 1918, the same time as the Armenian Genocide, the Ottoman Turks systematically and brutally targeted the Assyrians.
And it's crucial to remember this wasn't just random violence. It was a calculated strategy to create a more homogeneous Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. The goal was a state dominated by Turks and Muslims. This elimination of Christian communities was fueled by nationalism and religious fanaticism.
To add to that, in 1914, the Ottoman Sultan declared jihad against the enemies of Islam, basically giving permission for violence against Christians.
Right, that declaration had horrible consequences. It's estimated over 250,000 Assyrians, more than half their population at the time, were murdered during this period.
Those numbers are staggering. And it wasn't just the number of lives lost, but the methods used. Massacres, deportations, torture, wiping out entire communities.
To understand the impact on individuals, look at first-hand accounts.
Yeah.
In 1916, Abraham Yohanan, a professor at Columbia University, wrote, "The entire Christian nations of the Armenians and the Assyrians are undergoing extermination." He was pleading for the world to notice.
And there's another account from Assyrian father Joseph Naim's book in 1920. He described the Assyrian martyrdom, murders, deportations, and atrocities so horrific he couldn't even describe them.
And Naim's account and others remind us of the human costs of genocide.
Right.
Not numbers, but individuals, families, communities destroyed by violence.
So what happened in Hakkari in 1915?
Hakkari, the ancestral home for many Assyrians, became a central point for the genocide.
Okay.
The Ottomans, with Kurdish allies, attacked the Assyrian tribes who had lived there for generations.
And even though they were outnumbered and outgunned, the Assyrians resisted. They were trying to defend their homeland. What led up to the invasion of the Hakkari Highlands?
The Ottomans planned to weaken the Assyrians systematically. Early in the war, they tried to conscript Assyrian men into the Ottoman army.
Okay.
Many resisted, fearing they'd be forced to fight fellow Christians.
That resistance must have been seen as a sign of disloyalty. How did the Ottomans react?
Brutally. They started targeting Assyrian villages near the Persian border, forcing them to flee and resettle under stricter control. Talat Pasha, the Ottoman interior minister, ordered no more than 20 Assyrians to live in each resettlement area.
So basically they were trying to break up their communities, force them to assimilate.
Exactly. Cultural genocide. To destroy Assyrian society, erase their identity.
And these early attacks were just a prelude to the full-scale invasion of the Highlands, where many had sought refuge.
Right.
That invasion, starting in June 1915, was brutal. The Ottomans and Kurdish forces attacked, targeting the Assyrian tribes of Tiari and Gilu, who fought back.
The Assyrians, known for being warriors, put up a defense, even winning some early battles. But they were overwhelmed by the Ottoman army, with German rifles, machine guns, and artillery.
The totally uneven playing field.
Right.
Despite their bravery, they couldn't hold out. They were forced to flee to Persia to escape.
But even in Persia, they weren't safe.
Oh, no.
The Ottoman occupation of Azerbaijan led to more violence against Armenians and Assyrians.
So they basically took revenge on the Christian population, blaming them for their military losses.
The Ottoman army, led by commanders Cevdet, Kazim Karabekir, and Omer Naji, unleashed terror, attacking Christian villages across Azerbaijan.
Eyewitness accounts tell of total devastation, thousands murdered, villages burned, women abducted, and those who survived had to flee.
Right, and those accounts were recorded.
Okay.
One was published by the British government in 1916.
Okay.
It had testimonies from survivors and foreign observers, proving the atrocities in Azerbaijan.
Even though the world was focused on World War I, they were shocked by what was happening in Azerbaijan.
Right, the scale of the violence targeting civilians, the barbarity, it was condemned by many.
Yeah.
Sadly, it didn't stop the massacres.
It sounds like the Ottoman government faced some pressure but denied any wrongdoing and kept attacking Christians.
It was total impunity. They felt no consequences and continued their terror, wanting to wipe out whole communities.
And this didn't end with the war. In 1933, the Assyrians in Iraq faced another massacre, this time by the Iraqi army.
Right. The Simele Massacre was devastating for them. They hoped independence would bring security, but they still faced discrimination and hostility from the Iraqi government.
So what was at the root of this? Was it leftover resentment from the war or something else?
It was a mix.
Yep.
Part of it was lingering resentment.
Okay.
But also the Assyrians' hopes for self-determination played a role.
So after decades of persecution, they hoped for autonomy in the new Iraq.
Exactly. They asked the League of Nations for protection and the right to emigrate if their safety wasn't guaranteed.
But their appeals were ignored.
Yeah.
And Iraqi nationalism turned against them.
Right. Fueled by propaganda that portrayed them as a threat to unity.
Yeah.
This, plus existing prejudices, created a climate of fear and distrust, leading to the Simele Massacre.
The massacre started in August 1933 when Iraqi troops, joined by Kurdish tribesmen, attacked villages in northern Iraq.
It was planned and systematic, with the government determined to crush any resistance.
General Bakr Siddiqui was key to this campaign, and he reportedly got orders to eliminate any and all Assyrians.
Right.
That echoes what the Ottomans said just 20 years before.
Right.
The brutality of Simele shocked even those who'd seen World War I. A British eyewitness wrote, "I saw terrible things in the Great War, but Simele is beyond human imagination."
That statement is powerful. It speaks to the depth of cruelty humans are capable of, especially when driven by hate and feeling they won't be punished.
The Simele Massacre wasn't a one-time thing. It was part of a larger campaign that targeted over 100 Assyrian villages in Doak and Nineveh.
Right.
Thousands were killed, their homes destroyed, countless others forced to flee.
It's a heartbreaking chapter in Assyrian history. It shows how persecution continued and their fight for survival over centuries.
It also highlights why it's crucial to understand what leads to genocide.
Right.
It's not just about long-held hate.
No.
It's also about political opportunism,
Right.
manipulating fear and prejudice, and the cynical pursuit of power. And speaking of power, the Assyrians faced another threat in the 21st century, ISIS.
The rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria was terrifying for all minorities, especially Assyrians who had already suffered so much.
When ISIS took Mosul in 2014, they wanted to erase any trace of non-Islamic beliefs and practices.
Yeah.
Assyrians, with their long Christian history, were a prime target.
Right. ISIS's ideology, a twisted view of Islam, justified enslavement, torture, and murder of anyone who didn't conform.
Yeah.
They believed they were fighting a holy war, a twisted version of jihad.
And the results were devastating. Assyrian villages were overrun, churches and monasteries destroyed, ancient artifacts looted, and thousands forced from their homes, refugees in their own land.
Right.
One survivor described fleeing an ISIS attack. They said, "We heard people screaming as we neared. 2 young boys aged 6 and 8 who had been playing soccer were struck by a mortar. This is when we knew ISIS was coming. We gathered their remains and put them into an empty bag of chips and delivered them to their families. We realized the Peshmerga had abandoned us during the night. Word spread quickly, and then the church bells were ringing a signal that it was time to leave. We did not know if we would make it out in time. No human being should have to experience this kind of terror."
That account captures the terror the Assyrians faced as ISIS advanced.
Yeah.
Sadly, the trauma continues to affect thousands, many still displaced, trying to rebuild.
It's a stark reminder of how fragile peace is and the constant threat of extremism.
Right.
It raises questions about the responsibility of the international community to protect vulnerable groups.
Right.
But despite everything, the Assyrian people have shown incredible resilience.
Right. That's what's inspiring. Despite centuries of persecution, they've held onto their culture, language, and faith.
A real testament to their strength.
Exactly. It shows that even when faced with horrific acts, the human spirit can endure.
It's important we recognize and honor the struggles and triumphs of the Assyrian people.
Absolutely. Acknowledging the Assyrian Genocide, learning from its history, and working to prevent future atrocities is how we honor the victims and support survivors.
There's a quote that really resonated with me. "The people who survived genocide through will and determination went on to overcome it. They lived their lives, raised their families, formed careers, prayed in new churches, lived in new cities, and wept in silence over their physical and psychological scars. They share their stories with us, each a little bit varied but echoing the same message. Good eventually triumphs over evil, and men and women overcome hardship to become stronger and more resilient."
That captures their strength perfectly.
Yeah.
They refused to let genocide define them. They rebuilt, remembered, and honored their heritage.
That brings us to the lasting impact of genocide.
The effects of genocide go far beyond the violence itself. It leaves scars on individuals, families, and communities, impacting them for generations.
With the Assyrian Genocide, the impact is still felt today.
Right.
Millions around the world are descendants of survivors.
And they carry the weight of what was lost.
Right.
The pain of displacement, the struggle to keep their identity, the memories of what their ancestors went through.
The Assyrian Genocide resulted in millions of lives lost, their homeland destroyed, communities forced into displacement, their culture and language suppressed.
And it's not just the past. The effects are felt today in discrimination, instability, and the difficulty of rebuilding after such trauma.
We need to remember, genocide doesn't end when the killing stops. It echoes through generations, affecting survivors and their descendants. The Assyrian Genocide is a reminder of the consequences of hatred and intolerance.
And also a call to action.
Yeah.
We have a responsibility to learn from this, to stand against injustice, to work towards a future where these things never happen again.
And a good place to start is by acknowledging and remembering these events.
Right.
By keeping these stories alive, we honor the victims and prevent future genocides.
Exactly. Talking about it is so important. We need to raise awareness, support the community in their pursuit of justice and recognition.
You know, as we've been talking about the Assyrian Genocide, I've noticed the emphasis on cooperation among the different groups targeted by the Ottoman Empire. Can you talk more about that?
That's a really good point. The Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks face similar things, and their stories are really connected.
It makes sense that they would feel a sense of shared experience, a desire to work together to seek justice.
Absolutely. There are calls for more collaboration between these communities, recognizing that shared experience can be a source of strength.
What would that look like?
Working together, they can amplify their voices, challenge denial, and advocate for recognition and justice.
Yeah.
There are already initiatives bringing together Assyrian and Armenian groups working towards these goals.
It's a powerful example of unity against adversity.
It is.
This goes beyond just the three groups targeted by the Ottomans, doesn't it?
You're right, it does. Other communities, like the Yazidis, have also faced persecution. Their stories are important to acknowledge and remember.
Right.
It's about building understanding, empathy, and a united front against genocide and intolerance.
A message that goes beyond the Ottoman Empire. It's universal, about hope, resilience, and the power of human connection when facing adversity.
Exactly. Recognizing our shared humanity, regardless of background or belief, and working together to create a world where everyone is safe and respected.
Well said. As we go deeper into this, it's important to remember that genocide isn't just a tragedy of the past.
Absolutely. It's a threat that needs our constant attention and action.
Sadly, there are many examples of ongoing genocides and atrocities happening in the world right now.
And too often there's silence, indifference,
Yeah.
allowing the perpetrators to continue without consequence.
It's our responsibility to break that silence and speak out against injustice wherever it occurs.
Whether it's raising awareness, supporting human rights groups, advocating for political action, we all have a role to play in preventing genocide.
The Assyrian Genocide, with its long history of persecution and denial, is a reminder of what happens when we don't act. It shows the need for global solidarity.
Right. It's a call to action for all of us to stand up for human rights, challenge discrimination, and work towards a future where genocide is truly a thing of the past.
And that brings us to the events of September 67, 1955 in Istanbul.
Right. This was a dark time when anti-Greek violence swept through the city,
Good.
leading to widespread destruction, looting, and displacement.
These pogroms, as they're called, were a direct result of incitement and propaganda spread by Turkish nationalist groups,
Yeah.
often with the support of the government.
Right. They used a made-up incident, a supposed bombing of the Turkish consulate in Thessaloniki, Greece,
Okay.
to stir up anti-Greek sentiment and justify the attacks.
The violence was awful. Mobs attacked Greek homes, businesses, churches, leaving devastation behind.
Right. The Greek community, once a vibrant part of the city, was brutally targeted.
Thousands were forced to flee, livelihoods destroyed, their sense of security shattered.
The events of September 6 to 7, 1955, are a reminder of how fragile peace is and how easily hate and prejudice can be used for political gain.
Yeah, it's frightening how quickly a society can turn to violence when those in power don't uphold the law and protect everyone's rights.
These pogroms weren't technically genocide, but they share traits of ethnic cleansing and are a dark mark on Turkey's history.
It's important to say these weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern of discrimination and persecution against non-Muslims in Turkey throughout the 20th century.
Right, from the Armenian genocide to the forced assimilation of Kurds, Turkey has a history of suppressing diversity and trying to create a homogeneous national identity.
And this often leads to violence, intimidation, and denying basic human rights.
The events of 1955, although overshadowed by the Armenian and Assyrian genocides, remind us that the fight for justice and equality in Turkey is ongoing.
They show the need to deal with the roots of intolerance and create a society that respects the rights and dignity of all its citizens.
One disturbing thing about the 1955 pogroms is the role the government played.
Yeah, inciting the violence.
They didn't explicitly order the attacks, but they created a climate of fear that made it possible.
Right. They used propaganda, manipulating nationalist feelings. They failed to protect the Greek community,
Right.
all contributing to the tragedy.
Right. And after the violence, they didn't do much to hold people accountable or help the victims.
That lack of accountability sent the message that violence against minorities was okay.
Yeah.
And that message still resonates today as Turkey struggles with its past of discrimination.
Right. Their continued denial of the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocides is an example.
Their efforts to silence any talk about these atrocities and their persecution of those who speak out are really concerning.
It's a reminder that the fight for justice is far from over. We must hold those in power responsible.
You know, as we've been talking about the Assyrian genocide, I've been thinking about the different levels of responsibility.
That's a good point. Genocide is rarely just one person's doing. It usually involves many people, each with their own level of guilt.
At the top, you've got the leaders, political and military, who plan the genocide. They give the orders, the resources, the ideology that makes the violence seem okay.
And then you have the lower-ranking officials and soldiers carrying out the orders, often under pressure or influenced by propaganda.
Right. And then there's the wider society, some taking part in the violence, while others stay silent.
Right. Understanding these levels is important for history and for preventing future genocides.
So it's not about blaming everyone, but about understanding the situation and holding people accountable.
Exactly. And understanding what leads people to participate in genocide.
Right.
So we can stop it from happening again.
You know, as we've been talking, I've noticed the Assyrian genocide is often overshadowed by the Armenian genocide.
It's true. The Armenian genocide, with its scale and brutality, has rightfully received a lot of attention.
But we can't forget that the Assyrian genocide happened at the same time, part of the Ottoman campaign.
Right. Well, the Assyrian genocide was smaller. It was no less horrific.
They suffered the same violence, displacement, cultural destruction.
And their stories deserve recognition and remembrance.
Why do you think the Assyrian genocide is less known? Just because it was smaller.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
The Assyrian community has historically been more spread out and less politically organized.
So it's harder to have a unified voice.
Right.
Especially when you're geographically dispersed.
Exactly. But in recent decades, the diaspora has become more active, advocating for recognition and justice.
They've been crucial in raising awareness about the genocide and pushing for official recognition.
Right. And it's working.
Yeah.
More people are learning about it and its place in history.
And that's so crucial for preventing future genocides. And by understanding the patterns, the motivations, the consequences, we're better equipped to act.
Exactly. The Assyrian genocide, with its tragic history and the struggle for recognition, shows us how important it is to remember and to be vigilant in the face of intolerance.
It's a call to action for all of us to stand up, challenge discrimination, and work towards a future where genocide is truly a crime of the past.
I agree. And this deep dive has barely scratched the surface of the Assyrian experience.
There are so many stories of courage, resilience, and loss that need to be told.
And there's still a lot to be done.
Yeah.
To get full recognition, justice, and healing for the Assyrian community.
A responsibility we all share.
Yes.
Learning from the past, standing against injustice now, and working towards a more tolerant future. That's how we truly honor the memory of the victims of genocide.
I couldn't agree more.
All right, for the listener out there, let's step back and think about what we've learned so far.
We've defined genocide, looked at the 10 stages, and started to uncover what happened to the Assyrian people, starting in the 19th century and continuing to today.
Right, we've seen how religious and ethnic tensions, mixed with political ambition, created a situation where these atrocities were possible.
Right, and the human cost. Millions of lives lost, families broken, communities shattered, and the trauma that continues.
And we've explored the concept of denial, the tactic used to silence victims,
Right.
erasing their suffering from history.
Right, and we've stressed how important it is to fight against this denial, to speak the truth and demand justice for the victims.
We've talked about needing solidarity, cooperation, not just among the groups the Ottomans targeted, but everyone working for human rights to prevent these things from happening again.
Exactly. It's about seeing our shared humanity and making a world where genocide is truly in the past.
It's important to remember that the Assyrian genocide didn't just happen in one place. It was across different parts of the Ottoman Empire, each with its own complexities.
That's a great point. We've talked about Hakkari and Azerbaijan. But another important region was Diyarbakir, in what's now southeastern Turkey.
Okay. Diyarbakir was historically a very diverse province. Many Assyrians lived there, Armenians too, and other Christian groups. And sadly, it became a central point in the Ottoman government's extermination campaign.
The governor at the time, Mehmed Rashid, was ruthless.
Yeah.
He's often called the Butcher of Diyarbakir.
That's a chilling title. What made him so brutal?
Well, he was a strong Turkish nationalist, close to Talat Pasha.
Right.
He was key in carrying out the genocidal policies. He saw these communities as a threat to Turkish dominance and wanted to eliminate them no matter what.
So he wasn't just following orders, he was a driving force behind this.
Exactly. And his methods were horrific. He oversaw deportations of thousands of Assyrians, Armenians, other Christians from Diyarbakir, sent them on death marches.
Death marches. What exactly were those? What happened to those forced to go on them?
These marches were meant to be a slow, agonizing death. People were denied food, water, shelter, tortured, abused, and many were massacred along the way.
That's hard to imagine.
It was a horrible part of the genocide. Tens of thousands of Assyrians are believed to have died during these deportations from Diyarbakir. Their bodies left to decompose in the desert, a stark reminder of the Ottoman regime's cruelty.
It's just difficult to comprehend the scale of the cruelty, and these deportations weren't the only form of violence. What happened to the Assyrians who stayed in Diyarbakir?
His terror campaign didn't stop there. He oversaw massacres within Diyarbakir,
Oh, wow.
often with help from Kurdish allies.
So a systematic effort to eliminate the Assyrians completely. Was there any specific group targeted at first?
He focused on Armenians at first, but then it included all Christian groups in Diyarbakir.
So not one group, just anyone who didn't fit his vision of a purely Turkish and Muslim state.
Exactly. Religious and ethnic persecution fueled by an ideology that saw diversity as a threat.
As we talk about this destruction, I can't help but think about the impact on the Assyrians' ancient cultural heritage.
You're right. The Assyrians are one of the oldest civilizations with a rich history and culture, a language spanning millennia.
It wasn't just about killing people, it was about erasing their identity, their memory, wiping them out entirely.
Exactly. Churches and monasteries, some standing for centuries, were destroyed. Priceless artifacts were looted, libraries and archives with irreplaceable manuscripts burned, whole villages and towns gone.
It's hard to grasp that loss.
It was a deliberate attack on Assyrian society. They were trying to sever them from their past to make it impossible to rebuild.
This cultural destruction is a profound loss, not only for them, but for all of us.
It is. It reminds us that genocide isn't just about eliminating people, but erasing whole histories and cultures. It's a warning to be careful, to protect cultural heritage. These things are part of our shared human story.
It's a really good point. It's hard to imagine that in the midst of this horror, there could be any hope. Were there any instances of resistance?
There were. Even facing such horror, people found ways to resist, to protect their families and keep their faith and traditions alive.
It's amazing to hear that. Are there any examples?
One example is the defense of Abdin, a mountainous region in southeastern Turkey. Syriac Christians, including Assyrians, put up a fight against the Ottoman forces and their Kurdish allies.
I'm not familiar with Abdin. Tell me more about it.
Abdin, with its ancient monasteries, became a refuge for Christians fleeing persecution.
Okay.
When the Ottomans arrived, the people chose to fight back rather than surrender.
What did that resistance look like?
They got organized, found weapons, and took refuge in the hills. They were determined to defend their homes.
That must have taken incredible courage. Were there any specific locations where this was concentrated?
Two key places were the villages of Iwardo and Azak.
Eduardo and Azak. Tell me about them.
Iwardo, on a steep hillside, became a symbol of resistance.
Okay.
They managed to hold off attacks for months,
Wow.
even though outnumbered and lacking weapons.
That's remarkable. What helped them?
Well, they got support from local Yazidis, another minority group persecuted by the Ottomans, who joined forces with the Assyrians.
This is powerful. It shows that even in the darkest times, people can come together to resist and protect each other.
The defense of Iwardo is inspiring.
Absolutely. What about Azak? What happened there?
Azak, another village in Abdin, also became a center of resistance. It was home to different Christian groups, Orthodox, Catholics, Protestants.
Right.
And when the Ottomans ordered them to hand over members of other denominations for deportation, they refused.
So they stood together, despite their differences, to protect each other.
They armed themselves with whatever they could find and managed to fight off attacks.
Oh.
Their defense was fierce.
Yeah.
They held out for weeks, inflicting heavy casualties.
Wow, that must have been intense. What happened in the end?
The Ottoman government, frustrated, agreed to a truce. They let the villagers stay.
That's a victory, small but significant. It shows the power of resistance, standing up for what's right even when the odds are against you.
You're right. It's a reminder that even small acts of defiance matter, that courage can inspire others, and hope can exist even in the darkest times.
Truly inspiring. Are Eduardo and Isaac unique, or were there other instances of resistance?
These are just two examples. There were many acts of resistance. They may not have changed the overall outcome, but they show the human spirit resisting oppression, fighting for freedom and dignity.
These stories also highlight the local dynamics of genocide. It's not always a top-down event.
Right. There are local actors, conflicts, power struggles.
Yeah.
Understanding these is key to representing history accurately and developing prevention strategies.
It's about understanding that genocide isn't just abstract ideas. It's about real people, real communities, and the choices they make in unimaginable circumstances.
Exactly.
As we go on, it's important to note that the Ottomans weren't the only ones responsible.
Right. While they orchestrated it, they often had help from locals, including some Kurdish tribes.
That's a complicated issue. How do we approach understanding the Kurds' involvement?
It needs nuance. We have to recognize that many Kurds oppose the genocide, even risk their lives to protect their Christian neighbors.
That's inspiring. Any examples?
There are stories of Kurdish families hiding Assyrians and Armenians, giving them food and shelter, helping them escape.
That courage and compassion should be remembered. It shows us that even in such horror, humanity can shine through.
Absolutely. But we also have to acknowledge that some Kurdish tribes did participate. They carried out massacres, looted property, drove Christians from their homes.
Why would they do that? Was it just religious intolerance?
It was more complicated.
Okay.
Historical grievances, wanting to get ahead economically, and religious fanaticism.
So they were using the chaos to their advantage.
Right. Some Kurdish leaders saw it as a chance for power and land. Others were driven by religious extremism, wanting to get rid of Christians to establish Islamic dominance.
And some were probably just caught up in it all, influenced by propaganda and pressure to do things they wouldn't normally do.
That's a factor, too. Understanding these motivations is critical for historical accuracy and for figuring out how to prevent these things from happening again.
So it's not about blaming a whole group.
Right.
It's about understanding individual choices and motivations.
Exactly. Understanding how power dynamics, historical grievances, and economic inequalities create an environment where genocide can happen.
As we've been talking, it's clear the impact goes way beyond the violence itself.
Absolutely. Genocide doesn't just end. It has lasting effects that go on for generations.
So for those who survived the Assyrian Genocide, what were some of the long-term consequences?
For survivors, the trauma stayed with them long after the violence ended. The memories, the massacres, loved ones lost, homes and communities they had to flee.
It must be unimaginable to carry that. How did this trauma show up in their lives?
Yeah, many had post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, a profound sense of loss. They faced rebuilding in new places, often with discrimination, poverty, and the challenges of adapting to a new culture and language.
And this trauma wasn't just limited to the survivors, or?
No, sadly, it was passed down
Okay.
to their children and grandchildren. It shaped how they saw themselves in the world. Children of survivors often grew up hearing about it, seeing their parents' pain, carrying the weight of their family's history.
That must have had such a big impact.
They often struggled with feelings of anger, sadness, guilt, and a sense of injustice that the world had largely forgotten.
Yeah.
They may have felt a deep need to keep their culture alive.
To remember.
Right. This transmission of trauma across generations is really important, but often overlooked. It shows the need for ongoing support and healing.
For both survivors and their families.
Right. It also shows how genocide isn't just a historical event. It's a process that continues with lasting impact. The Assyrian Genocide shows this perfectly.
It reminds us that the wounds run deep.
Yeah.
The healing can take generations.
It's also a call to action, to support survivors, acknowledge their suffering, and work towards a future where this doesn't happen again.
What's striking is that it wasn't an isolated incident.
Right.
It was part of a pattern of persecution.
The Assyrian Genocide was the result of a long history of discrimination, attempts to eliminate their identity.
And this continued even after the Ottoman Empire fell. Assyrians faced new threats in the new countries of the Middle East.
That's right.
In Iraq, they faced discrimination and violence
Yes.
from the government and others.
Right.
The Simele Massacre in 1933 is a clear example. What about Turkey? Did things get better for them there?
Not really. In Turkey, the government tried to show unity and progress, but Assyrians still faced pressure to assimilate, to give up their language and culture.
So it's like the Ottoman Empire's policies continued, just in a less obvious way.
You could say that. It was subtle, like discrimination in schools and jobs, limits on religious practice, erasing their history from textbooks.
So less violence, but the prejudice remained.
It did, and it sometimes turned into violence, like the Istanbul Pogroms in 1955, mainly against Greeks, but it also affected other Christian minorities, including Assyrians.
So it shows that genocide isn't just one event. It can go on in different ways, from direct violence to discrimination and erasing their culture.
That's really important, and it's something we have to fight in our own countries and globally. We have to challenge intolerance, promote diversity, and protect the rights of everyone, no matter their background.
As we've been talking about the Assyrian Genocide, I see a lot of similarities with what the Armenian community went through.
It's true, they both faced persecution and violence under the Ottomans.
Right.
They both experienced huge losses, and both have been fighting for recognition and justice.
Given that, there must be a strong sense of solidarity between them.
There is. It's led to calls for more cooperation and solidarity between the two communities. Many believe that by working together, they can be stronger, challenge denial, and push for justice.
That's always good to see communities coming together.
Yes.
Are there examples of this?
There are initiatives bringing Assyrian and Armenian organizations and people together to work towards these goals.
What are they doing?
They're sharing resources, coordinating campaigns, and organizing events to raise awareness about their connected histories.
That's a powerful example of finding strength in shared experience.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond just those two communities, doesn't it?
You're right. It reminds us that genocide doesn't just impact isolated groups. It's a global issue that needs a global response.
So by working together across borders, we can work towards a better world where these horrors don't happen again.
Exactly.
One of the most disturbing things about the Assyrian Genocide is how much it was planned.
Right.
This wasn't just something that happened suddenly. It was a planned campaign of extermination.
And the evidence is clear.
Yeah.
We have the official orders calling for deportation and massacres,
Right.
often using code words to hide what they were really doing.
And we have the stories of those who survived,
Right.
who saw how systematic it was.
Right.
Rounding up communities, taking their property, forcing them into the desert.
And we can't forget the context. The Ottoman Empire had a history of discrimination and violence towards its Christian minorities.
So they saw Christians as a threat
Right.
to their national unity, their security.
Exactly. They thought the only way to eliminate this threat was to remove them, either through deportation or extermination.
And the Armenian Genocide, happening at the same time, really strengthens this idea of premeditation.
Right. They used the same tactics, the same words, the same people to target both groups. It was genocide.
This planning makes it even more horrifying. It wasn't just chaos, it was the state using violence against its people.
And it shows us how important it is to recognize the warning signs, to act early.
Too often, the world has just watched as genocide unfolded, not doing anything until it was too late.
Exactly. We have to learn from the past and be ready to act, protect people.
As we talk about the Assyrian Genocide, the question of justice comes up. What does justice really mean after something this awful?
That's a really important question. And it's complicated. There isn't an easy answer. Justice after genocide has many different aspects.
So it's not just about punishing the people who did it.
Right.
What else does it mean?
On one level, it means holding them accountable, bringing them to trial, exposing what they did, and making sure there are consequences.
So then it doesn't happen again.
Exactly. Justice is also about acknowledging the suffering of the victims.
Right.
And giving them some kind of compensation for what they went through.
It's not just about punishment. It's acknowledging the harm. What would that look like?
It could be reparations, apologies, memorials, things that honor the memory of those lost and recognize the impact on survivors and their families.
Are there other important parts of justice?
Truth-telling is vital. It's about uncovering the full history, challenging those who deny it, and making sure the victim stories are heard and remembered.
That sounds crucial for healing.
It is. Facing the past, however painful, is the only way to learn and prevent it from happening again.
And ultimately, it's about making sure it doesn't happen again.
Yes, that's the goal, to create a world where these things aren't possible, where diversity is valued and everyone is treated with dignity.
That's a good goal. How can we do that?
It takes commitment to human rights, to tolerance, to social justice, and to solving conflicts peacefully. It's a long road, but it's one we have to take to honor those who suffered.
Well said. You know, one thing that's really stood out to me is the resilience of the Assyrian people. They've kept their culture, language, and faith through centuries of persecution.
It is remarkable. Despite being all over the world, they've held on to their heritage, passed down their traditions. They've built communities, churches, cultural centers, working to keep their language and traditions alive.
It's amazing their culture survived. What do you think helped them do this?
It's a testament to their spirit, their determination to survive, and their belief in preserving their identity.
It's a reminder that even in the face of horror, human culture and the human spirit can live on.
Exactly, and we should support the Assyrian community, help them rebuild and ensure their culture and heritage thrive for generations to come.
It's heartbreaking that the world forgot about the Assyrian genocide for so long. Their suffering was ignored, their stories untold, their calls for justice unheard.
It's true. There are a few reasons why this happened.
Okay.
Compared to the Armenian community, for instance, they've been more dispersed, less politically organized.
So it was hard to get attention and advocate on a global level.
Right. And then there's the political situation in the Middle East.
Right.
The Assyrian genocide has been overshadowed by other conflicts in the region.
With so much going on, it's easy for things to get lost.
You're right. Things like the rise of Arab nationalism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Iran-Iraq war, the conflicts in Syria and Iraq more recently have taken attention away from the Assyrian genocide.
And of course, there's the denial. The Turkish government trying to stop any discussion of the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocides.
Right. Turkey has spent decades denying responsibility, saying it was just chaos during the war.
Right.
That they didn't plan to get rid of Christian minorities.
That denial has been effective in shaping how people see things and silencing the victims. Has it also made it hard to research and document what happened?
It has. Scholars and activists have had trouble accessing archives, doing research, and showing the full extent of what happened.
But the Assyrians never gave up.
They didn't.
On getting recognition and justice.
And lately, thanks to their work and Assyrian organizations and people, the Assyrian genocide is getting more attention.
That's good to hear. What's changed?
Governments, international organizations, and scholars are recognizing the Assyrian genocide as a fact. They are condemning the denial and calling for it to be commemorated.
This recognition must be so important for them.
It is. It shows the power of truth-telling and fighting for justice.
It shows that even the most horrible things can be brought to light, that the victims can be heard, and the pursuit of justice can overcome those who deny it and those who try to keep it hidden.
I agree. It gives us hope.
Speaking of hope, one thing that's really stood out to me is their dedication to education.
That's a key part of their story. Despite the trauma, they understand education is how they can protect their heritage and prevent future atrocities.
What have they done to achieve this?
They've set up schools, cultural centers, and research institutes focused on teaching younger generations about their history, language, and culture.
They are making sure their culture isn't forgotten.
They are. They've also worked hard to make the world aware of the Assyrian genocide in schools and universities, making sure this part of history isn't forgotten.
That's really important work. It helps make sure future generations learn from the past and are able to prevent it from happening again.
It does. This commitment to education shows they believe in the power of knowledge to combat hate.
It's a powerful reminder that education is vital for a more just and compassionate world, where diversity is celebrated and all people are treated with dignity and respect. It's clear that the Assyrian genocide is complex and doesn't have an easy explanation.
You're right. It's a story of suffering, but also of incredible resilience. It's loss and displacement, but also keeping their culture alive and reviving it. It's injustice and denial, but also people still searching for truth and recognition.
A story that has lessons for all of us.
It reminds us how fragile peace is, the dangers of intolerance, and how important it is to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard.
It also shows us the importance of empathy, understanding, and building connections with other cultures and communities.
The Assyrian Genocide should inspire us to work for a future where these things don't happen again, where diversity is celebrated and everyone is treated with respect.
Well said. It's important to remember that the Assyrian Genocide isn't just history.
Right.
It's still shaping lives today.
You're right. It's not something that just happened and is over.
Right.
It still impacts survivors and their descendants.
Yeah.
They carry the trauma, the loss, the fight for recognition.
It reminds us that the effects of genocide run deep and can last for generations.
Absolutely. It's a call to action for all of us to support survivors,
Yeah.
acknowledge their suffering, and work to make sure these things don't happen again.
One of the most inspiring things is how determined the Assyrians are to rebuild.
It is remarkable. Despite everything, they've shown resilience.
They've established communities in new places, built churches, cultural centers,
Right.
worked to keep their language and traditions alive.
Their determination shows how strong the human spirit is,
Yeah.
the power of hope,
Yeah.
the importance of cultural identity.
It's a beautiful reminder that even in the darkest times, life goes on.
Yes.
The pursuit of a better future can overcome the darkness of the past.
I couldn't agree more.
The Assyrian Genocide isn't just a tragedy for the Assyrian people, it's a tragedy for everyone.
Genocide, no matter who it happens to, stains all of us. It shows what humans are capable of and how fragile peace is.
It challenges us to do better, to be more vigilant in defending human rights.
Right.
And to build a world where these things don't happen again.
The Assyrian Genocide, with its tragic history and the fight for recognition, shows us how important memory, justice, and being vigilant are when faced with intolerance.
It's a call for all of us to stand up for human rights, challenge discrimination, and work towards a future where genocide is truly a thing of the past.
I agree. And that starts with understanding.
And understanding starts with listening
Right.
to those who experience these horrors.
The voices of survivors are crucial. They give us insight into the human cost and the lasting effects of trauma.
One powerful account comes from an Assyrian survivor of the Simele Massacre.
Right.
They were 10 years old.
They describe the terror of that day. Iraqi soldiers attacking their village,
Yeah.
shooting into homes, burning everything.
They talk about running away, hiding, constantly afraid.
Right. Seeing their friends and neighbors, children shot,
Yeah.
their bodies left in the sun.
Their story, and so many others like it, show how devastating genocide is, how it destroys families and communities, leaving wounds that take generations to heal.
These accounts also challenge those who deny it. They prove how brutal and systematic it was,
Right.
countering any attempts to downplay the victim's suffering.
They show how important it is to listen and believe survivors, to help them share their stories and to make sure they are remembered.
You know, one thing that really stands out is how resilient people are.
Yeah.
Even after going through something so horrific, they found ways to rebuild,
Yeah.
to make new communities, to keep their culture alive.
They found strength in their faith, their families, their history. They supported each other and found ways to cope.
Right.
This resilience is a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit.
It is.
It shows the importance of hope, human connection, and the power of our cultural identity.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always the possibility of light, healing, and renewal.
As we've explored the Assyrian Genocide, it's clear there's no easy answer. To justice or to healing,
You're right.
it's complex.
It's not one solution. Justice can take many forms.
It might mean holding the perpetrators legally accountable, putting them on trial, making them face the consequences.
Or reparations, apologies, officially recognizing the genocide and its impact.
Telling the truth, uncovering the whole history, fighting against those who deny it, making sure the victims' stories are heard.
And it always means healing, providing support and resources for survivors and their families as they deal with the trauma.
Seeking justice and healing is hard, but it's necessary.
Right.
If we want to truly honor the victims and stop this from happening again.
It's a journey we all need to be a part of.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive, it feels important to ask, what can we learn from the Assyrian Genocide? How can we make sure something this horrible never happens again?
That's the question, isn't it? The answer is understanding what causes genocide, what the warning signs are, and being ready to act to stop it.
So it's not just about remembering the past. We need to work to prevent it.
Exactly. Genocide doesn't usually just happen. It comes from a mix of things: historical grievances, political instability, economic inequality, and then there's how fear and prejudice are used.
It sounds like there are many different things that lead to these events.
There are. If we address those underlying issues, If we promote tolerance and understanding, if we strengthen institutions that protect human rights, and if we hold leaders accountable, we can create a world where genocide is truly a thing of the past.
So we need to work on the root causes, but we also need to be ready to act when we see the warning signs.
Absolutely. We have to be able to spot those signs. Things like hate speech, discrimination, targeting specific groups, and the escalation of violence.
And when we see those signs, we can't just watch,
Right, we have to be ready to act.
both as individuals and as a global community.
Exactly. It might mean speaking out, supporting human rights groups, pushing for political change, or even directly helping those in need.
It sounds like everyone could do something big or small.
Every action matters. The Assyrian Genocide, with all its tragedy and the fight for recognition, shows how fragile peace is. It shows we need to work together globally to stand up to intolerance and violence.
It's a call to action. We need to be more than just bystanders. We need to defend human dignity and work together to create a world where this never happens again.
Well said.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Assyrian Genocide. It's been a difficult but crucial conversation.
It has. And it shouldn't end here. Keep learning, engage with the Assyrian community, support their efforts for recognition and justice, and be a voice for peace and understanding.
Remember, knowledge is power. Understanding the past can help us create a better future.